Welcome back to our fourth installment of the sweater seaming video tutorial that I'm doing for you here. I've set in my sleeves, I've seamed my shoulders, I've done the side and sleeve seams now on this sweater, so it's just about done. I have a hood that my son requested on his back to school sweater, so I'm going to show you how I fit that in. Basically, we have a big hood fitting into a small neckline space. So I'll show you my tricks for that, and then we'll do a little bit of tail weaving in. Later on for my son, I'm going to be putting a little zipper into this. I'm not going to include that in our installment for this video because I really just kind of go at it haphazardly. Often I'll do a crochet edge here, and then I will recommend to people that they bring the zipper to a tailor to have it sewn in, because it's just not my forte. So I'm going to struggle along with it, and I don't want to embarrass myself by showing everybody how that's done. Or I may just take my own advice and bring it to a tailor to have them seam it in once I have an edging made here. But generally for a zipper, you'd need some sort of firm edging, whether it's crocheted or a couple rows knit, just so that you have something to seam the zipper into. It always adds a nice finish. All right, so let's do the hood. And there are so many ways to do hoods. Maybe your sweater calls for you to pick up stitches around the neckline and knit the hood attached. That's great, go for it. In this one, I just did a separate hood, partially because I knew I'd be doing these videos and I wanted to have another seam to show everybody. And the other piece was that I was knitting this on the go, and it was easier for me if I was able to knit the hood separately than if I were to have knitted attached. So I'm going to start the hood the same way that I started my sleeve, actually. I'm going to start in the center back and the center of the hood, leaving out, I have a nice long tail of my finishing yarn, and I'm going to leave half of it out to seam up the other side. So I'm going to find the center here of my hood. I have a little shaping here at the top, so I can just follow that line straight down and find generally the center right here. And I'm grabbing a V, and I'm going to pull my yarn through, leaving half of it out on the other side. And then here at the back neck, I'm going to find the center. So you can either fold it, if you want to be very precise, you can count into the middle. I'm not always super precise, and that's okay. Depends. This is, you know, the nice thing about knitting is that we get to do things the way that makes us feel comfortable. So you can certainly count if you want to. So I'm going to start by working just a general single stitch to single stitch seam. I have two bound off edges, or really have a cast on edge here and a bind off edge on the back neck of my sweater. So I'm working it in single stitch to single stitch, and then I'm going to reassess. Originally, I thought I had a lot more stitches on the hood than in the fabric of the sweater, but it might work out totally evenly where I don't need to do much setting in. If I needed to do some setting in of the hood where I had to take up extra fabric, you can take a stitch and a half from the hood or from the body if you need to, in order to help get it fit in. So you could take a stitch, so the full V plus 1/2 of the next stitch, and pair that with a single stitch on the other part if you need to start squeezing something in, kind of puckering it on your own. But yeah, it looks like it should be pretty smooth to get in here, so that's nice. Sorry for you viewers that you don't get to see me kind of go wild trying to squeeze it in, but nice for me. Let's see, so here, I've now shifted here in the same way when we were setting in the sleeve caps, we had a shift in stitches. Here they were vertical stitches, cast on, bind off edge. Now I still have my cast on edge right here, but now I've got an edge here with rows. So I'm going to take a stitch to 2 rows, a full stitch to 1 row. Here I'll alternate it a little bit. Got all these tails here. That is the one drawback of not weaving them in first, is that they sometimes get in the way as you are seaming. but we'll get through this together. All right, stitch and a row, stitch, and every so often I'm reassessing just to make sure that everything is matching up. Stitch, or a row and a stitch. Now here I'm going to take the side, I bridge that gap the same way we did when we were doing the sleeve cap, and a stitch, because now I'm back to bind off edges. And look at me, I didn't pull at all that whole time. Let's get that in, there we go. Now here I'm at the front of the sweater. I worked my ribbing already on the hood because I knew I'd be doing some sort of zipper on the edge. So I already worked the band here, and I'm just going to set that right in to the front neck of the sweater here. And here I'm going to take single rows. So I may need to take a half of a stitch on the body. So half of a stitch to a single row. And a full stitch to a single row just to kind of even it out. Half of a stitch, single row. Half of a stitch, single row. So it is possible to slow down the seam, so to speak, and take fewer stitches at a time. So a half of a stitch or a stitch and a half. You can't really go more than a stitch and a half though. It doesn't look good to do 2 stitches, like to put your needle under 2 V's and try to make a seam that way. So never go above a stitch and a half. And the stitch and a half technique should only be used really if you're setting something in and you need to get it to fit. Like I wouldn't use that as the fail-safe. The fail-safe is always single to single when you are seaming stitches to stitches. So that's half of my hood set into the sweater, into the neck of the sweater. Looks pretty cute. Now I'm going to flip it over, and again with the right side facing, grabbing my yarn that was waiting for me, I'm going to repeat that process down the other side of the neck. So, and again, it was mostly single stitch to single stitch. And then when I got into that bar section at the front neck right here, I alternated single, double, just that was more by feel. Like I kind of had a sense that would be how it works out. So some of those intuitions that you may have about seaming come with practice. You know, I've seamed hundreds of sweaters together, so I just get a feel for things sometimes that again only really come with practice, and you'll get there. Maybe not hundreds of sweaters worth, but definitely some confidence, even after just a handful of sweaters. All right, so here I'm taking the double and the single. So I'm alternating, always taking a stitch from the hood and alternating 2 bars, single bar, 2 bars, single bar. Down the side, I'm gonna tighten it up. When I cast on for my hood, I did cast on half my stitches, or 2/3 of my stitches, and then increased here on row 3. So that's probably why I have enough space here to really seam it in well. Okay, here we go. Now this has shifted again. I now have stitches to stitches. And here's another shift. I've got rows here now from the band and stitches on the bottom, so or on the top here. So I'm taking a half of a stitch to 1 bar, half of a stitch to 1 bar, full stitch to 1 bar, half of a stitch to 1 bar, half of a stitch, 1 bar, and then come in at the side, same way you ended off the sleeves and side seams, and come in on the other side too. There we go. And then again, sometimes I like to give a little bit of a tug just to loosen everything up. But here we go. Oh my gosh, so cute. It's gonna look adorable. All right, so that would be seaming in the hood. You can see it's right there. Okay, so I will demonstrate how to weave in tails, and then I will wish you luck on your sweater seaming journeys. Please be sure to tag me in pictures on Instagram, or if you do any videos on YouTube of your seaming, just keep me in the loop. I'd love to see what you work on. All right, here I had a tail in the middle of the work. I just cut out the knot that was attached to it. I'm going to thread that on my needle. What I do when I add tails or new yarn, I just start knitting my next stitch with the new yarn. I don't do any fancy joins, anything like that. Later on, what I do, you'll see I'm missing the bridge between these two yarns since I didn't join them. I'm going to make that manually. So I've got my needle threaded with the working yarn from the left-hand side here. I'm going to go over to the right-hand side where this yarn is coming down, and I'm going to bring this through, and you'll notice I've just closed up that gap with what would have been there. That little kind of curvy piece would have been there had there been no break in the yarn. And then what I'm going to do is a diagonal weave, a duplicate stitch through here. This yarn is an acrylic blend, so it really is not going to have a lot of the grab factor that wool does. So I've come across like this, and then I'm going to come backwards for a pass or two. The reason I come back in the direction I came from is because I want the yarn to catch. If this hood gets pulled, or the, you know, if it gets moved around, zhuzhed around, whatever, I want that yarn to catch right here. So if this hood pulls that way, the yarn may tug, but it'll stop. And if it pulls this way, it may tug, but it'll stop again. So I go backwards just for a pass or two. So now here, I'm going to recover that same stitch that I had previously done, and then I'm going to go now to the right with this yarn, weaving in that same kind of diagonal zigzag wave. This tail's a little short. Zigzag wave for about an inch or two, and then I'm going to come back towards the left, back towards the center. Trim my tail close to the sweater, and that's the weaving in. And it looks a little obvious here to me, but on the right side, no one's the wiser, especially when I block it. It'll be phenomenal. All right, then if you have seam tails near a seam, those are nice and easy, and I'll show you. Pull the sleeve inside out. So here were tails from when I joined a new ball of yarn. I'm going to cut them even, leaving enough that I like to weave in with, which is for me about like 6 or 7 inches. And then pinching the seam, I'm going to dive my needle, just graze it right under the seam. I want to be sure I'm not digging into the sweater, of course. So I'm just grazing right under the seam. I'm going up and down, up like a serpentine, right under the seam. And then once I've gone for an inch or two in one direction, the same thing, I go back for a pass or two, just like that, to catch the yarn. Cut. And same thing at the cuff here, where I've got these two yarns. I've got my finishing yarn, and I've got my garment yarn, the yarn I used for the sweater. Here we go. I'm just going to come right under there. If you're using a yarn that's a significantly different color from your sweater to do the seaming, you may want to pause here, take your actual working yarn, and just kind of close up any gaps here, or cover up any of that contrasting yarn. That's sort of a, you know, personal thing. Just kind of peek around and see if there's any stitching you need to do. So I came about 1.5 inches, 2 inches that way, and now I'm coming back for just a couple passes. And then I trim my yarn, and that's that. And so you would just weave in all your tails, do whatever neckline finishing or front band finishing. But that is the gist of sweater seaming, and I so thank you for joining me on this adventure of seaming. It's my goal to make sure people enjoy seaming, because you know, it just opens up a world of possibilities too in terms of different sweater designs that you can knit. And hopefully some of them will be mine. Again, please share and stay in touch, and happy knitting.